If you listen closely to the night, beneath the sound of the wind and the traffic, you can hear the heartbeat of the world. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It is a steady, comforting rhythm, a reminder that time is moving forward, carrying us away from our pasts and into our futures. But in the narrow cobblestone street of a town that time forgot, there was a shop where the past refused to leave. The sign above the door was faded, the gold paint peeling to reveal the gray wood beneath. Elias Thorne, horologist. To the locals, it was just the clock shop, a place to fix a wristwatch or buy a grandfather clock for the hallway. But to those who stepped inside, it was a cathedral of gears. The shop smelled of things that are rare in the modern world. It smelled of walnut oil, used to polish the wood. It smelled of brass and cold iron. It smelled of dust that had settled on secrets. The walls were lined from floor to ceiling with clocks. There were cuckoo clocks from the Black Forest, their small wooden birds sleeping behind shuttered doors. There were mantel clocks of marble and gold, sitting heavy and silent like judging kings. There were pocket watches hanging from hooks like ripe fruit on a metal vine, and all of them were ticking, but they did not tick in unison. That would be maddening. They ticked in a chaotic, gentle harmony, a symphony of seconds, stumbling over each other, creating a blanket of white noise that made the air feel thick and warm. In the center of this symphony sat Elias. He was a man constructed of sharp angles and worn tweed. His hair was the color of steel wool, and his hands, once steady enough to engrave a prayer on the head of a pin, were now covered in the faint tremors of age. He sat at his workbench, a pool of yellow light from an articulated lamp illuminating a scattering of tiny brass wheels and springs. He was not alone. Perched on the corner of the workbench, watching the movement of the pliers, with eyes like molten amber, was Orion. Orion was a cat of significant size, and even more significant silence. His fur was a deep, russet orange, ticked with black, the color of autumn leaves in the twilight. He had a notch in his left ear, a souvenir from a life before he found the shop, and a tail that moved with the slow, hypnotic rhythm of a pendulum. Orion was not a pet. He was a partner. When Elias dropped a screw, which happened more often these days, Orion did not chase it. He simply placed a heavy paw on it, stopping it from rolling off the table, and waited for Elias to retrieve it. "Thank you, old friend," Elias would murmur, his voice rusty from lack of use. Orion would blink slowly. "You are welcome." Focus. They had grown old together, the man and the cat. They moved with the same stiffness on rainy days. They shared the same dislike for loud noises and sudden knocks at the door. They were two gears in the same machine, grinding slowly toward the end of their spring. But there was a third presence in the room. In the far corner of the shop, away from the window, stood an object covered by a heavy white linen sheet. It was tall, taller than a man. Its silhouette suggested the shape of a grandfather clock, but broader, deeper. The other clocks in the shop were for sale. They had price tags. They had futures in other people's homes. This object had no price tag. It had no future. It was the anchor. It was the reason the lights stayed on late into the night. It was the reason Elias's hands trembled more when he looked at that corner. Orion knew the object well. Sometimes, when Elias was asleep in the armchair upstairs, Orion would walk over to the covered shape. He would rub his cheek against the linen. He could hear the silence inside it. It was a wrong silence. A clock should have a heartbeat. This one had a void. Tonight, the rain was drumming against the shop window, blurring the streetlights outside into smears of watercolor. Elias put down his tools. He sighed, rubbing his eyes under his spectacles. The escapement is tricky on this one, he said to the cat. My fingers are stiff tonight. Orion chirped, a soft trilling sound. Rest, the cat suggested. The fire is warm. Elias looked at the cat, then at the covered corner. A shadow passed over his face. The kind of shadow that comes from a cloud that has been hovering for years. He stood up and walked over to the sheet. He reached out a hand, hesitating. Then he pulled the linen down. The Lullaby Clock was breathtaking, even in its unfinished state. It was carved from dark cherry wood, polished until it glowed like an ember. The face of the clock was not just numbers. It was a map of the night sky, inlaid with mother-of-pearl stars. But the heart of the clock, the space below the face where the pendulum and the chimes should be, was empty. It was a hollow chest. I can't get the tone right, Orion, Elias whispered. He touched the wood reverently. It has to be perfect. It has to sound like her. He closed his eyes, remembering. He remembered his wife, Alara. He remembered how she used to hum in the kitchen. A specific melody. A lullaby she had invented for the children they never had. It was a simple tune. 3 notes up, 2 down. A resolve in the minor key. She asked me to finish it, Elias said, his voice cracking. Before she went into the dark, she said, "Make it play our song, Elias, so I can hear it where I'm going." He looked at his shaking hands. I promised, and I am failing. Orion jumped down from the workbench. He walked over to Elias and wound his body around the old man's ankles. Purr, purr, purr. He tried to push the warmth back into his human, but Orion felt it too. The cold was not just in the room. It was in the cat's own bones. Orion stumbled. His back legs gave way for a second, weak and unresponsive. He corrected himself quickly, leaning against Elias for support. But Elias saw it. The old man looked down. He saw the dullness in the amber eyes. He saw the labored breathing of the cat. The fear that gripped Elias's heart was colder than any winter night. "No," Elias whispered, scooping the heavy cat into his arms. "Not you, too. You cannot leave me alone with this silence." He looked at the unfinished clock. "I haven't fixed it yet," he pleaded to the universe. "I need more time." But the clocks on the wall just kept ticking. Tick, tock, indifferent, unstoppable, counting down. Time is a cruel mechanic. It does not care for the quality of the machine. It only cares about the winding of the gear. And every gear, no matter how beautifully crafted, eventually grinds to a halt. In the days that followed, the rhythm of the clock shop changed. Before, it had been a place of industry. The soft scritch-scratch of metal files, the clink of brass on wood, the hum of the old man humming along to the radio. Now, the industry had stopped. The workbench was cold. A layer of fine gray dust began to settle on the pliers and the magnifying loops, undisturbed by human hands. Elias did not sit at the bench. He sat in the armchair by the cast-iron stove, his body bent into a question mark of worry. On his lap lay a cushion, and on the cushion lay Orion. The great russet cat, who had once patrolled the shelves like a tiger guarding a temple, was now just a heap of fur and shallow breathing. The amber fire in his eyes had dimmed to a muddy brown. His tail, usually so expressive, lay still, wrapped tight around his nose, as if trying to preserve the last scraps of body heat. Elias stroked the cat's flank. His hand moved with a repetitive, soothing motion. Stroke. Pause. Stroke. Pause. It was the only work his hands could manage now. It's just the damp, Elias whispered to the room, lying to himself with the ease of the desperate. The winter damp gets into the joints. A little rest, a little warmth. He'll be chasing dust motes by Tuesday. But Tuesday came and went, and Orion did not chase anything. He refused the saucer of cream. He turned his head away from the sardine, a treat that used to make him dance on his hind legs. Elias watched the ribcage of the cat rise and fall. Inhale, rattle, exhale. It sounded like a clock with a broken escapement. A mechanism that was skipping beats, struggling to keep time. Elias knew that sound. He had spent his life fixing it in machines, but he could not open up the cat. He could not replace the mainspring. He could not oil the heart. He felt a profound, crushing impotence. He was a master of fixing things, yet the two most important things in his life, the lullaby clock and the cat, were beyond his repair. He looked over at the dark corner where the clock stood covered by the sheet. The white linen looked like a shroud in the dim light. The guilt gnawed at him. I should be working, Elias thought. I promised her. I promised Ilara I would finish the song. But how could he work when his hands were shaking? How could he tune a delicate chime when his ears were straining to hear if the cat was still breathing? I will work when Orion is better, he bargained with the universe. Just let him stand up. Just let him eat. Then I will finish the clock, I swear it. The universe did not answer. The clocks on the wall kept ticking, indifferent. Tick-tock, tick-tock. Usually, the sound comforted him. Now, it sounded like a countdown. It sounded like sand running through an hourglass that was almost empty. Night fell early, bringing a heavy, suffocating fog that pressed against the shop windows. Elias lit a single candle. The electricity felt too harsh for the sick room the shop had become. He prepared a dropper with warm milk and sugar. Come on, old friend, Elias coaxed, gently prying open the cat's jaw. Just a sip. For me. Orion swallowed weakly. He let out a faint, rasping purr, not a sound of contentment, but a sound of reassurance for his human. I am trying, the purr said. I am staying as long as I can. Elias set the dropper down. He buried his face in his hands. The fear washed over him, a cold tide rising from the floorboards. He remembered the night Ilara died. The silence of the hospital room. The feeling of the world stopping. He had survived that loss because he had Orion. The cat had been a bridge back to the land of the living. A reason to get up and open a can of food. A warm weight on the bed. If you go, Elias whispered into the darkness, the bridge breaks. If you go, I am just an old man in a room full of dead machines. He looked at the lullaby clock again. He felt a sudden surge of resentment toward it. It demanded so much. It demanded perfection. It demanded a song he couldn't quite remember clearly anymore, because the grief was clouding his memory of her voice. You took my time, he accused the covered object. I spent my nights with you, instead of playing with him, and now his time is gone. It was an irrational thought, born of exhaustion, but it stuck. The clock was a symbol of his failure. He stood up, his knees cracking. He walked over to the corner. He didn't uncover the clock. He adjusted the sheet, tucking it tighter, hiding the wood completely. Sleep, he told the clock. No more work. Not now. He turned his back on the promise. He went back to the armchair. He picked up Orion, cradling the heavy, limp body against his chest. He sat down. He began to rock. Back and forth. Back and forth. The movement was hypnotic. Outside, the rain began to fall again. tapping against the glass like fingers asking to be let in. Inside, the only sound was the breathing of the man and the cat, syncing up, slowing down, preparing for the end of the winding. Elias closed his eyes, but he did not sleep. He kept watch. He held the cat as if his arms alone could keep the soul inside the body. He held him against the silence. The candle on the side table had burned down to a stub. The flame was drowning in a pool of melted wax, flickering frantically, casting long, jumping shadows against the rows of silent clocks. It was the hour of the wolf. That deep, colorless time between 3 and 4 in the morning, when the world seems to hold its breath, waiting to see if the sun will bother to rise again. Elias was awake. He had not closed his eyes for 2 days. He sat in the wingback chair, his arms numb from the weight of the russet cat. Orion's breathing had changed. Earlier, it had been a rattle. Now, it was a series of long, terrifying pauses. Inhale. Silence. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3 seconds. Exhale. Elias counted the pauses. He found himself holding his own breath, trying to lend the rhythm of his own lungs to the small creature. Stay, Elias whispered. It wasn't a command. It was a beg. Just stay until the morning. The light helps. The light always helps. But the light was far away. Orion shifted slightly. He stretched his front paws out, kneading the air one last time. A memory of comfort, a reflex of happiness from a time before the pain. He opened his eyes. The muddy brown film had cleared for a moment. The amber fire was back, burning bright and lucid. He looked up at Elias. He didn't look afraid. He looked attentive, as if he heard a door opening that Elias could not hear, as if someone had called his name from the other side of the room. Orion let out a sigh. It was a long, shuddering release of air. It carried the tension from his muscles, the ache from his joints, and the weight of his years. The ribcage settled. Elias waited. He stared at the flank of the cat, waiting for the rise. 1 second, 2 seconds, 5 seconds, 10. The candle flame gave one last violent pop and went out. A thin ribbon of gray smoke drifted up into the darkness. Elias put his hand on the cat's chest. There was no flutter. The engine had stopped. The mainspring had unwound completely. The silence that filled the room was heavier than stone. It pressed against Elias's ears, a physical pressure that made him dizzy. Orion? He said the name, but he knew there would be no ear twitch, no tail flick. He sat there for a long time in the dark, holding the cooling body. He stroked the ears. He smoothed the fur. He didn't cry. Tears are for the living, for the people who have hope of being comforted. Elias had no hope. He had only a cold, hollow certainty. He was the last one left. Slowly, stiffly, Elias stood up. He carried Orion to the workbench, the place where they had spent thousands of hours together. He cleared away the tools. He pushed aside the brass gears and the magnifying glasses. He laid the cat down on the wooden surface. He arranged the paws gently, tucking them in, making him look like he was merely sleeping through a long afternoon. He took his own tweed jacket off and laid it over the body, covering the russet fur. Rest now, Elias whispered to the pile of tweed. No more cold. Elias turned away. He looked at the shop. The wall of clocks stared back at him. Tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. The sound, which had been his lullaby for 40 years, suddenly sounded like an insult. How dare they? How dare the gears keep turning? How dare the pendulums keep swinging? How could the mechanism of the world continue to function when the heart of it had stopped? It was disrespectful. It was a lie. No, Elias said. His voice was cracked and hard. No more. He walked to the nearest grandfather clock, a towering mahogany piece from 1890. He opened the glass door. He reached in and grabbed the brass pendulum. He held it. The ticking stopped. He felt a grim satisfaction. He had killed the time. He moved to the next clock, a mantel clock with a porcelain face. He turned it around and removed the battery. Silence. He moved to the cuckoo clocks. He unhooked the weights, letting the chains pool on the floor. Silence. He moved through the shop like a wraith, silencing the chorus. One by one, the voices of the machines were extinguished. The room grew quieter and quieter. The white noise that had protected him from his thoughts was stripped away, leaving him exposed to the raw silence of the grave. Finally, the last clock was stopped. The shop was dead. Elias stood in the center of the room. He felt dizzy. The silence was ringing in his ears. He turned slowly toward the dark corner. The lullaby clock stood there, draped in its white sheet. Elias walked toward it. He didn't pull the sheet down. He placed his hand on the linen, feeling the cold wood underneath. He thought of Alara. He thought of the song. He thought of the promise. Finish it. But he looked at his hands. They were shaking so badly, he couldn't have held a spoon, let alone a screwdriver. And he looked at his heart. It was broken. A broken machine cannot fix another machine. I can't do it, Alara, Elias whispered to the ghost of his wife. I tried. God knows I tried. He leaned his forehead against the covered clock. I am not strong enough, not without him. He was the one who kept the cold away. He slid down to his knees. I failed you, he confessed to the empty air. I failed both of you. He felt the heavy gray fog of the guilt settling on his shoulders. It wrapped around his throat, choking him. He realized, with a terrifying clarity, that he would never leave this shop. He would not finish the clock. He would not sell the business. He would not move on. He would sit here, in the dark and the silence, until the dust covered him just as it covered the tools. He stood up slowly. He walked back to the armchair by the cold stove. He sat down. He didn't try to light the candle again. He didn't try to start a fire. He simply sat in the dark, staring at the lump of tweed on the workbench. He folded his hands in his lap. He closed his eyes. Take me, he whispered to the shadows. I'm ready. There's nothing left to wind. The shop was silent. The cat was gone. The clock was stopped. And Elias Thorne waited for the end. Chapter 2. The Golden Field. The darkness did not last. There was no long tunnel, nor a blinding flash of white light at the end of a corridor. There was simply a breath. One moment, the weight of the tweed jacket pressed down on tired ribs, the cold seeping into the marrow of old bones on a hard wooden workbench. The next moment, there was warmth. It was a sensation not felt since kittenhood, a liquid golden heat that soaked into the fur and loosened every knot in the spine. Opening his eyes, Orion expected the dusty beams of the clock shop or the sound of rain drumming against the glass. Instead, the world had turned to gold. A field of tall, swaying wheat stretched out to the horizon in every direction, the stalks the color of honey, brushing against his sides with the softness of silk. Above, the sky was a deep, impossible violet, scattered with stars that shone bravely even in the daylight. And dominating the heavens was a sun, a massive, gentle orb of amber light, hanging low, bathing the landscape in an eternal, perfect afternoon. Orion stood still, bracing himself for the pain, the sharp stab in the hip that always accompanied standing up, the rattle in the chest, the heavy drag of age. He waited for them to return. But the pain, was a ghost that had been left behind. Shifting his weight, the russet cat felt only lightness. Power surged through limbs that had been frail only seconds ago. Looking down at his paws, the gray hairs had vanished. The coat was deep and rich again, ticked with black, rippling with restored health. The claws, extended experimentally, were white, sharp, and perfect. The air tasted sweet, carrying the scent of oatgrass, wild catnip, and fresh cream, filling lungs that expanded without resistance. Whole, the thought echoed in his mind. I am whole. The realization was electric. Crouching low in the grass, a tail twitched with forgotten agility. A blue butterfly, the size of a sparrow, fluttered past. In the shop, such a sight would have been watched with weary eyes. Here, instinct took over. Launching himself into the air, Orion cleared the top of the wheat stalks in a graceful arc. Landing light as a feather 5 feet away, he turned and jumped again. Running became a necessity, not from fear, but from the sheer joy of ability. Tearing through the golden field like a streak of orange fire, muscles bunched and released, lubricated and strong. The wind rushed through his whiskers, a song of speed and freedom. Reaching the top of a small hill, he skidded to a halt, panting not from exhaustion but from exhilaration. Below lay the new kingdom. Thousands of others were there. Great lions napped on sun-warmed rocks. House cats chased leaves that transformed into birds. Kittens wrestled in the clover without a care. There were no fences, no cars, no barking dogs. Only the endless afternoon remained. This was the good place. The sanctuary Elias had whispered about in the dark. Rolling onto his back in the grass, exposing a soft belly to the sun, Orion wriggled, scratching an itch he hadn't been able to reach for years. A purr rumbled in his chest, a sound like a distant thunderstorm, loud and deep, vibrating with pure contentment. Closing his eyes, he soaked in the peace. Young again. Safe. Home. Even in paradise, memory is a tether that cannot be easily cut. While the initial rush of freedom had sent Orion sprinting through the amber wheat, a quiet gravity eventually began to pull at his senses. The sun was warm, yes, and the air was sweet with the perfume of eternal summer, but there was a silence underneath the beauty. A space where a familiar rhythm should have been. Tick, tock. The sound was missing. The absence of the clocks felt like a hole in the fabric of the world. Wandering away from the playful wrestling of the kittens and the basking lions, paws moved silently over the clover, seeking a quieter corner of the golden field. The landscape changed gently. The rolling hills of wheat gave way to a grove of silver birch trees. Their bark peeled in delicate, paper-thin strips, white as bone against the violet sky. In the center of this grove lay a pool. It was not a pond fed by a stream, nor a puddle left by rain, for rain did not fall here. It was a perfect circle of water, flat and dark as a mirror of obsidian, rimmed by moss that glowed with a faint, bioluminescent pulse. Water, in all worlds, is a conduit. It is the heavy element that holds memory. Approaching the edge, the instinct was to drink. The thirst of the run was present, but as the russet head lowered, the water did not reflect the violet sky or the silver trees. It rippled, though no wind blew. The surface swirled, turning from black to gray, dissolving the reflection of the cat's face, to reveal a window looking down into another place. Another time. A cold draft seemed to rise from the water, smelling of wet pavement and old iron. The image sharpened. It was the shop. Seen from above, the workshop looked small and fragile. a box of shadows huddled against the storm. Rain lashed against the glass of the front window, blurring the streetlights into weeping streaks of yellow. Inside, the candle had burned out. The darkness was absolute, save for the gray light of the street filtering in. And there, sitting in the wingback chair, was Elias. He had not moved. The tweed jacket still covered the empty space on the workbench, where a body used to be. The tools lay scattered, gathering the first layer of dust. But it was the man himself that stopped the breath in Orion's throat. Elias looked smaller. The architecture of his face had collapsed, the lines of worry deepening into canyons of despair. He sat with his hands folded in his lap, staring at the covered shape of the lullaby clock in the corner. But there was something else, something that had not been there before. Coiling around the old man's shoulders was a mist. It was faint, barely visible against the gloom of the shop, but to the eyes of a spirit it was undeniable. A sluggish, heavy vapor, the color of wet ash. It moved with a serpentine intelligence, wrapping around Elias's throat, pressing down on his chest. This was not a ghost. This was the physical manifestation of the culpa, the weight of the unkept promise. It was feeding. With every shallow breath Elias took, the mist grew slightly denser, slightly darker. It was drinking the will to live. It was freezing the heart. Orion leaned closer to the water, whiskers trembling. A low, distressed sound bubbled up in his throat. From this vantage point, the truth was terrifyingly clear. Elias was not just mourning, he was fading. The mist was sealing him in. If he died now, with that heavy gray weight around his soul, he would not rise. He would not find the path to the golden field. He would be too heavy to ascend. He would remain there, in the cold, damp shop, haunting the unfinished clock forever, a ghost of regret. The contrast was violent. Here, the sun was eternal. The grass was warm. The body was young. There, the rain was relentless. The room was freezing. The man was dying. A paw reached out, touching the surface of the pool. The water was ice cold. The ripple distorted the image of Elias, fracturing his face into a dozen shards of sorrow. Look up. The cat projected the thought, pushing it down through the layers of reality. Look up, old man. I am here. But Elias did not look up. He slumped further into the chair, his chin resting on his chest, surrendering to the mist. The connection was one way. The dead can see the living, but the living see only the absence. Pulling back from the water, Orion paced the edge of the pool. The tail lashed back and forth, a metronome of agitation. This paradise, this perfection, it tasted like ash in the mouth now. What good was the sun if the one who had given him warmth for 15 years was freezing? What good was eternal life if it meant eternal separation? The joy of the golden field evaporated, replaced by a fierce, protective loyalty. The instinct of the watcher. He looked at the white sheet covering the clock in the vision. Finish it, the thought echoed. You have to finish it. But Elias couldn't. Not alone. The mist was too heavy. Orion stopped pacing. He looked up at the violet sky, then back down at the dark water. He realized then that he was standing on the wrong side of the reflection. Safety was here. But love was down there, drowning in the gray. And a cat, a true cat, never leaves a job unfinished. The pacing continued, back and forth along the rim of the dark pool. Russet paws wore a path in the luminous moss. The agitation was a physical vibration, a dissonance in the perfect harmony of the golden field. It did not go unnoticed. From the shadow of the silver birch grove, a figure emerged, It was not a lion, nor a tiger, but a cat of immense and ancient dignity. Her fur was the color of moonlight on snow, pure, blinding white. Her eyes were not amber or green, but a pale, star-washed violet that seemed to see both the past and the future simultaneously. She moved without bending the grass, her presence radiating a calm that felt heavy, like a thick blanket. She sat down near the agitated newcomer, wrapping a tail as fluffy as a cloud around her paws. "You disturb the water, little brother," she murmured. Her voice was not spoken. It resonated in the mind, sounding like the wind sighing through canyon walls. The pool is for reflection, not for sorrow. Sorrow is heavy. It sinks. Orion stopped his pacing. He looked at the white sage. In the hierarchy of the fields, she was an elder, one who had been here since the pyramids were young. "Look at him," Orion projected, gesturing with his muzzle toward the gray image in the water. "He is drowning?" The sage lowered her head, peering into the obsidian mirror. She watched the mist coiling around Elias's throat. She watched the unmoving hands. "Ah," she whispered, a sound of gentle recognition. "The mist of the unkept promise, the tether of guilt. It is a common malady among the makers. He is dying." Orion insisted, the urgency sharp in his thoughts. "When he dies, he will come here. He will be warm again. I just have to wait." The sage looked up, her violet eyes filled with a terrible, soft pity. "No, little brother, he will not." The words hung in the sweet air like stones. Orion froze. "What do you mean?" "This place," the sage explained, sweeping her gaze across the golden wheat and the violet sky, "is the land of the light heart. To rise here, the soul must be lighter than a feather. It must be unburdened." She looked back at the water. "That mist, it is lead. It binds him to the earth. If he passes with that weight upon his chest, he will not ascend. He will remain in the shadows of his shop, trapped in the loop of his regret, winding clocks that never tick, forever cold, forever alone." The horror of the verdict settled into Orion's bones. Eternal separation. Elias in the cold dark, Orion in the warm light, forever. It was not paradise. It was a hell disguised as a meadow. The clock, Orion realized. He has to finish the clock. If he finishes it, the promise is kept. The mist lifts. "Perhaps," the sage agreed, "but he has stopped moving. He has given up. Who will start the mechanism again?" Orion looked at his own paws. They were strong. They were young. They were capable of pushing a tool, of nudging a hand, of keeping a chest warm through a long winter night. "I will," he stated. The sage blinked slowly. "You are here, Orion. You have crossed the bridge. The current only flows one way. To swim back is to fight the river of time itself." "I do not care about the river," Orion growled, the fur on his neck bristling. "I care about the man." He turned his back on the pool. He turned his back on the sage. He looked toward the horizon, where the golden field met a wall of swirling nebula, the boundary of the realm. "I am going back." "You will lose this," the sage warned gently. "You will lose the sun. You will lose the youth. You will lose the peace. Peace without him is just silence," Orion replied. "And I have had enough of silence." He began to walk. He did not run this time. He walked with the heavy, deliberate gait of a creature marching into a storm. He left the grove of silver trees. He left the playful kittens and the sleeping lions. He walked toward the edge of the world, where the golden wheat ended and the stars began. He was leaving heaven, not because he was cast out, but because it wasn't good enough. It was missing the one thing that made life worth living, the person who needed him. Chapter 3. The Guardian of Seconds. The golden field did not end abruptly. It faded like a melody tapering off into silence. As the russet pause carried Orion further from the center of the realm, the landscape began to transform. The soft honey-colored wheat grew sparse, the stalks becoming brittle and translucent, shimmering like spun glass. The warm, loamy earth beneath turned hard, shifting from soil to a smooth, cool surface of polished quartz. The eternal afternoon sun, which hung so comforting and low over the meadows, began to recede behind him. Ahead, the sky deepened. The violet hue darkened, bleeding into a rich, velvety indigo, and finally into the absolute diamond-studded black of the deep cosmos. This was the hinterland, the border between the resting place of souls and the machinery that kept the universe turning. Walking here felt different. In the fields, movement was effortless, a joy of muscle and wind. Here, movement was a negotiation with gravity. The air grew thinner, tasting less of cream and catnip and more of ozone and cold iron. It was a scent familiar to a clockmaker's cat. It smelled of precision. The silence changed too. The rustle of grass and the purr of contented spirits were replaced by a low, resonant thrumming. It was a vibration that could be felt in the teeth, a frequency so low it was almost outside the range of hearing, yet it was the foundation of everything. It was the sound of the great mainspring of existence, slowly unwinding. Orion did not falter. The memory of the gray mist coiling around Elias's throat was a cold spur in his side, urging him forward. The path of quartz widened, leading upward toward a structure that defied the organic logic of the fields below. It was not a gate of pearly clouds. It was a construction of light and geometry. Massive rings of silver and gold floated in the void, rotating slowly around each other like the gimbals of a celestial gyroscope. They were etched with runes that glowed with a pale blue fire, the mathematics of time. Between these rotating rings stretched a bridge made of starlight, narrowing to a single point that hung over the precipice of the universe. Approaching the bridge, the scale of the place became overwhelming. A cat is a small thing, a creature of corners, of undersides of chairs, of warm laps. This place was a cathedral of the infinite. To walk here was to admit one's own insignificance. Yet the small orange speck moved on. There was no fear in the stride. Cats possess a unique armor against awe. They carry their own universe inside them. To a cat, the size of a room or the size of a galaxy matters less than the intention of the walker. And the intention here was absolute. Reaching the edge of the quartz plateau, the view opened up. Below, there was no ground. There was only the swirl of galaxies, spiral arms of milk and fire turning in the dark. And standing, or rather hovering, at the entrance to the Starlight Bridge was the warden. It was not a cat, nor was it a human. It was a shape born of the environment itself. At first glance, it resembled a great horned owl, immense and terrifying, with a wingspan that could blot out a constellation. But it was not made of feathers. Its feathers were overlapping plates of bronze and silver. Its eyes were not biological. They were two large, ticking clock faces, glowing with a fierce white light. Its talons were made of escapement gears, clicking against the stone. The guardian of seconds, the watcher of the threshold. The entity did not turn its head, yet it saw. Its presence was a wall of pressure. It radiated a law. Forward is the only direction. Return is impossible. Orion stopped 10 paces from the Guardian. The wind of the void ruffled his fur. The cold was biting here, stripping away the comfort of the golden field. Settling haunches against the cold quartz, the russet tail curled neatly around front paws, a precise, deliberate gesture of composure. Gold eyes fixed upward, locking onto the ticking face of the Titan with unwavering intensity. Silence was his choice. No meow escaped his throat, no beggar's plea softened his stance. Against the vast, cold machinery of the cosmos, the small cat became an anchor of stubborn life, his entire posture projecting a single, undeniable truth. I am here, and I am not staying. The Guardian shifted. The sound of metal feathers sliding against each other rang out like chimes. One of the clock eyes focused on the cat. The hands on the face spun wildly, then locked into position. You are out of bounds, little spirit. The Guardian's voice boomed. It sounded like the tolling of a great bell, deep and mournful. The meadows are behind you. The rest is behind you. Here, there is only the work. Orion stood up. He took a step toward the bridge. I have work to do, he projected, his thought clear and sharp. The Guardian spread its wings, blocking the path entirely, a wall of gears and ticking metal. No work remains for the dead, the Guardian stated. Your time is spent. Your spring is unwound. Go back to the sun. My time is spent, Orion agreed, staring into the ticking eyes. But his is not, and I am going to wind him up. The wings of bronze did not fold. Instead, a low grinding noise resonated through the platform, the sound of cosmic tumblers falling into place, locking the door to the past. Entropy is the law, the metallic voice intoned, vibrating through the quartz floor. To return is to swim upstream against a waterfall of time. It breaks the swimmer. Why leave the peace? Why seek the cold? Images of the shop flashed in Orion's mind, projected outward with fierce clarity, defying the logic of the machine god. The dusty workbench appeared in the space between them, the silent pendulum, and most terrifying of all, the gray mist tightening like a noose around the old man's neck. Because the piece is false. The thought voice cut through the void, sharp as a diamond. He's drowning in silence. If I do not turn the key, he never leaves the room. He becomes a ghost of regret. The ticking eyes of the owl narrowed, gears whirring softly as they adjusted focus, zooming in on the timeline of the clockmaker. A beam of white light scanned the threads of destiny woven into the dark below. The man is finite, the Guardian observed coolly, dismissing the emotion. His gears worn, his mainspring is fractured. He is scheduled to stop. This is the nature of things. Grief is simply the friction of separation. It is not the stopping that matters, Orion argued, stepping closer to the precipice, fur riffling in the stellar wind. It is the way he stops. If he stops in the dark, with the promise broken, he becomes rust. He becomes heavy. He will not rise to the fields. The small cat looked up, challenging the immense entity. You guard the flow of time. You ensure the gears turn smoothly. But a soul trapped in guilt is a broken cog. It jams the machine. I am not asking to make him live forever. I am asking for the chance to let him die well. Silence stretched between them, filled only by the deep, rhythmic thrumming of the universe. The Guardian considered the logic. There was truth in the small creature's projection. A soul tethered to the earth by regret creates drag. It creates an anomaly in the smooth transition of energy. To release the man, the work must be finished. The circle must be closed. Slowly, the massive wings began to retract. the metal feathers sliding over each other with a sound like wind chimes in a winter breeze. The barrier was lowering, but the danger remained. "The argument has merit," the guardian rumbled, the clock hands in its eyes slowing their spin. "A broken promise is a flaw in the design. It should be corrected." The owl leaned down, the heat of its internal furnace washing over the quartz platform. "But the bridge of starlight is built for the ascent of light, weightless things. It cannot carry a spirit backward. To descend into the gravity of Earth, you cannot be a memory. You must be solid. You must have weight." The guardian's voice dropped, becoming grave and final. "And to have weight is to feel pain." A tremor ran through the bronze feathers of the great owl, a vibration of immense, ancient machinery shifting course. The decision had been made. The logic of the heart had, for once, superseded the logic of the clock. "So be it," the guardian announced, the words echoing like thunder rolling across a valley. "If the cycle is broken, it must be mended by the one who broke it." Slowly, terrifyingly, the massive entity began to dismantle its defensive posture. The wings, which had been a wall of impenetrable metal, lifted high into the ink-black sky, casting shadows that stretched across the quartz plain. The ticking eyes ceased their frantic spinning, settling into a steady, solemn rhythm. Behind the guardian, the starlight bridge dissolved. It did not break. It simply faded, the light retracting until only the void remained. In its place, a different path was revealed. Not a bridge to walk across, but a spiraling chute of dark gravity, plunging straight down into the swirling clouds of the mortal realm far below. It looked like the throat of a storm. "This is the chute of rainfall," the guardian explained, gesturing with a talon made of polished brass. "It leads to the damp, to the heavy air, to the ticking clock. But know this, traveler, the toll is not paid in gold nor in prayer." The owl leaned closer, the heat of its internal furnace washing over the small cat. "To enter the heavy world, you must become heavy. You cannot carry the light of the fields with you. You cannot carry the knowledge of the stars." Orion stared into the abyss. The cold rising from it was familiar. It was the smell of the London rain, the smell of the slate roof, the smell of the struggle. "I do not need the stars," the thought projected back, firm and unyielding. "I need my pause. I need my voice." "You will have neither as you know them," the guardian warned, the voice dropping to a whisper that vibrated in the marrow of Orion's bones. "The descent strips away the self. You will not return as a spirit guide. You will return as flesh, fragile, hungry, mortal." The great beak clicked shut. "Are you prepared to forget the sun? To forget the peace? To forget yourself?" Looking down at the swirling gray clouds far below, a memory surfaced, not of the golden wheat, but of a trembling hand holding a screwdriver, and a voice whispering, "Thank you, old friend." That memory was heavier than any sun. "I am ready," Orion signaled. The guardian nodded, a slow, majestic dip of the bronze head, then stepped forward, clockmaker's cat. The descent begins. Standing at the precipice of the universe, the edge of the quartz platform felt sharp and absolute against the pads of russet paws. Behind lay the endless afternoon, the scent of oatgrass, and the promise of a pain-free eternity. Ahead lay only the churning, slate-gray vortex of the mortal atmosphere, a swirling bruise in the fabric of the night. The guardian of seconds remained silent, a bronze sentinel witnessing the rarest of events, a volunteer for suffering. No further words were needed. The contract was sealed not in ink, but in will. Orion closed his amber eyes, taking one last breath of the thin, sweet air of the hinterland. It filled his lungs with starlight, a final reserve of fuel for the journey down. Then he leaned forward. Gravity, which had been a polite suggestion in this realm, suddenly became a tyrant. It grabbed him. It didn't pull him gently. It snatched him from the ledge with the violence of a raptor taking prey. The quartz floor vanished. The ticking eyes of the owl receded into the distance, becoming two fading stars. The fall began. It was not a sensation of flying. Flying implies freedom. This was a sensation of becoming heavy. As the russet shape plummeted through the layers of the cosmos, the transformation started. First, the golden glow that surrounded his fur was stripped away by the friction of the descent. It peeled off like a second skin, dissolving into the void, leaving him dark and small against the vastness of space. Next went the agility. The supernatural lightness that allowed him to leap over wheat fields evaporated, replaced by the dense, aching reality of bone and muscle. The phantom pain in the hip returned, a sharp, cold needle, threading itself back into the joint. The air grew thicker, colder, screaming past his ears. It was no longer the silence of the spheres. It was the roar of the wind. The memories began to loosen. The image of the golden field blurred, the colors washing out like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The taste of the eternal cream faded from his tongue. I am... The thought started, but the end of the sentence was snatched away by the gale. I am Orion. He tried to think, clinging to the name. But the name felt slippery. It felt heavy. It didn't fit through the narrow aperture of the world below. To enter the heavy world, one must be empty. Loosening his grip, he let the name go. It drifted upward, lost in the slipstream. He was no longer Orion. He was just a shape. A spark of intent plummeting toward the clouds. A seed of love wrapped in fur, falling toward the soil of the city. Cobblestones met bone with a jarring, unforgiving thud, shattering the silence of the descent. There was no soft landing here, no celestial cushion to break the fall, only the brutal, unyielding solidity of the waking world. Blackness swallowed the moment, a concussion of the senses where time seemed to fold in on itself, erasing the sky, the stars, and the memory of flight. Slowly, agonizingly, sensation began to bleed back into the void. First came the cold. Not the crisp, invigorating chill of the space between stars, but a wet, seeping misery that soaked instantly through the sodden fur, gnawing at the skin with teeth of ice. It was the specific, bone-deep dampness of a winter gutter. Then came the smell, acrid smoke, rotting vegetables, gasoline, the sharp ammonia tang of a city that had been rained on for weeks, assaulted the nose, a violent, pungent contrast to the sweet oat grass of the place that was forgotten. Shivering in the shadows of a narrow alleyway lay a small, russet heap. Groaning, the creature tried to lift its head, but pain flared hot in the shoulder. Gravity's tax for the return trip. Blinking against the grit, amber eyes opened to a world of gray shadows and falling water. Rain lashed down in relentless sheets, drumming a chaotic rhythm against metal trash cans, gurgling in the choked drains, washing away the last lingering specks of stardust. Scrambling to his paws, claws slipping on the slime-coated stones, he shook himself violently. A spray of dirty water flew outward, but the dampness was already skin-deep, a heavy cloak he could not shed. Wild-eyed, he scanned the brick canyon. Where was this? Why was the air so heavy? Questions floated in his mind, unanchored and drifting like debris in a flood. There were no answers attached to them. Trying to summon a name for himself felt like trying to catch smoke with bare paws. Orion? The sound echoed in his head, meaningless, just another noise in the wind. He tried to summon a purpose. The clock? The man? Vague, blurry shapes danced in the periphery of his memory. A flash of polished brass, a pair of old, gentle hands. But they dissolved into mist the moment he tried to focus on them. All that remained was an ache. A deep, hollow pulling sensation centered in the chest, insistent and undeniable. It felt like hunger, yet no food would satisfy it. It felt like a compass needle forged from sorrow, pointing relentlessly toward a destination he did not understand but could not ignore. Go, the instinct commanded. Find. Find what? The answer was missing, locked away behind the clouds. Staying here was not an option. The alley was exposed, a wind tunnel channeling the gale like a predator seeking the weak. Hunching shoulders against the downpour, the cat took his first tentative step on the mortal plane. Small, alone, mortal. Yet, deep in the darkness of those amber eyes, a tiny spark of stubborn gold still burned, the only ember carried down from the sun that never sets. Limping forward into the storm, he followed the pull, guided by nothing but the ghost of a promise he could no longer remember making. Chapter 5. The Cold Alley. Hunger is the first teacher of the living. Before memory, before logic, before even the concept of self, there is the hollow ache in the belly that demands to be filled. Waking in the alley was not a sudden event, but a slow, miserable drag into consciousness. Rain drummed a relentless rhythm on the tin roof of an overturned garbage bin, the sound magnified by the narrow brick walls. It was a cold, industrial lullaby that offered no comfort. Curled tightly into a ball beneath a rotting wooden pallet, the russet cat shivered. Every muscle fiber vibrated, generating tiny sparks of heat that were immediately stolen by the damp air. Opening amber eyes, he saw only grays and blacks, the colors of a world without a sun. Instinct took the wheel. There was no I to make decisions. There was only the biological imperative. Find warmth. Find fuel. Crawling out from the shelter of the wood, paws sank into mud mixed with oil. The sensation was revolting. A slick chemical coating that clung to the fur, weighing down limbs that felt too heavy, too fragile. A noise from the street mouth, a roar of tires on wet asphalt, and the blinding sweep of headlights sent him scrambling back into the shadows. Fear, sharp and electric, spiked in his chest. This world was loud, it was fast, it was hostile. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. Every puddle reflected a fragmented, terrified face he didn't quite recognize as his own. Navigating the maze of the alley required a new kind of grace. Not the celestial floating of the fields he couldn't remember, but a low-to-the-ground, jagged movement. Slipping behind a stack of crates, he paused, nose twitching. A scent drifted on the wind. Beneath the stench of refuse and exhaust, there was something else. Faint, almost imperceptible. Wood smoke. It wasn't food. It wasn't shelter. But the smell triggered a phantom sensation, a memory of heat on his flank, a roughness under his cheek. The pull returned. It tugged at his center, stronger than the hunger, stronger than the fear. Ignoring the trembling in his legs, he turned away from the dumpster that promised easy scraps. He turned toward the smell of the smoke. Guided by a compass made of ghosts, the small, wet creature began to pick his way through the urban wilderness, searching for a door he had never seen, but had known all his life. Emerging from the relative shelter of the brick canyon, the world expanded into a chaotic, terrifying panorama. The street was a river of light and noise. Monsters of iron and glass roared past on wet tires, their eyes blindingly bright, cutting through the fog like searchlights seeking prey. They sprayed sheets of dirty water onto the sidewalk, indifferent to the small life clinging to the curb. To a creature who had known only the silence of the shop and the peace of the golden field, this cacophony was a physical assault. The vibration of the heavy engines traveled up through the pavement, rattling teeth and shaking bones that felt too light, too hollow. Shrinking back against a rough stone wall, the russet cat flattened himself into a shadow. In the place he had come from, he was a being of light, capable of leaping across wheat fields. Here, he was prey. A sudden, thunderous bark shattered the rhythm of the rain. Behind a wrought iron gate nearby, a massive shape lunged, a dog, teeth bared, straining against a chain. The sound was explosive, a violent detonation of aggression that sent a spike of pure adrenaline flooding through the cat's bloodstream. Panic, cold and sharp, seized his muscles. Scrambling away, claws skittering uselessly on the slick concrete, he bolted. There was no dignity in this flight. It was a desperate, low-to-the-ground scuttle, seeking any hole, any cover that would block out the noise. Diving beneath a parked car, the world narrowed down to a dark, oily rectangle. Here, at least, the rain could not reach him. The engine above him ticked as it cooled, a metallic, dying heat that offered a cruel parody of the warmth he sought. Curled tightly on the asphalt, surrounded by the smell of rubber and grease, a profound sense of wrongness settled over him. This body was weak. It shivered uncontrollably. The hunger was now a sharp pain, twisting his stomach. A memory, faint as a whisper, drifted through his mind. I was not always this small. But the memory had no shape. It was just a feeling of lost height, of lost power. Peering out from under the tire, the streetlights reflected in the puddles looked like cold, drowned stars. The city was a labyrinth of hard edges and hostile noises. Yet, the pull remained. Ignoring the terror of the dog and the roar of the iron monsters, the invisible thread tugged at his chest again. It pointed away from the car. It pointed down the street, past the noise, toward a quiet corner where the shadows were deeper, and the air smelled faintly of time. He had to move. To stay was to freeze. Creeping out from his metal cave, he lowered his head against the wind and continued the pilgrimage. Exhaustion is a heavy coat, soaked through and dragging at every step. By the time the iron monsters had faded into the distance, and the roar of the city had dulled to a background hum, the small russet cat was stumbling. Paws numb, belly hollow, he turned a corner into a narrow, cobblestone lane that seemed to belong to a different century. Here, the streetlights were dimmer, casting pools of amber light that struggled against the fog. The wind died down. The rain fell straighter, a quiet, persistent weeping, and there it was. Stopping in the middle of the whetstones, he stared. It was just a shop front, a faded sign, a dark window, a recessed door. To any other set of eyes, it was just a closed business, dark and uninviting. But to him, it was a lighthouse. The pull, that magnetic aching tug in his chest, suddenly stopped pulling and started humming. It was the sensation of a key sliding into a lock. Here. The thought wasn't a word. It was a feeling of absolute placement, like a puzzle piece hovering over the only gap it could fill. Creeping closer, Drawn by a gravity stronger than the Earth's, he approached the window. Condensation blurred the glass, but through the streaks of water, faint shapes were visible. Tall, shadowy silhouettes, standing like sentinels. The glint of polished brass catching a stray beam of streetlight, he pressed his nose against the cold pane. A scent drifted through the cracks in the old wood frame. It wasn't the smell of food. It was better. Walnut oil. Dust. Old paper. The smell hit his olfactory senses and triggered a cascade of phantom sensations. The roughness of a tweed jacket, the vibration of a purr, the safety of a high shelf. He didn't know what these things were, but he knew he needed them. He knew, with a desperate, biological certainty, that his survival lay on the other side of that glass. Moving to the door, he found it formidable. A barrier of solid oak, painted a peeling green, towering above him like a cliff face. He sat on the doorstep, a tiny island of wet fur in the dark. He waited. But doors do not open for wishes. They open for action. Reaching up, he extended his claws, sharp white needles. He dug them into the wood. Scritch. The sound was small, swallowed by the rain. He tried again, putting his weight into it, raking down the paint. Scritch. Scratch. It was a plea, a knock, a demand to be let back into the story. He laid his ears back, listening intently. Inside, the silence held. Then, a sound. Not a clock ticking, not a machine. A footstep. Heavy, slow, and shuffling. The sound of a person who does not want to be disturbed, approaching the threshold. The cat stopped scratching. He looked up at the brass handle, his heart hammering against his ribs, waiting for the judgment of the giant on the other side. Chapter 6. The Stranger at the Door. Inside the shop, the darkness was not merely a lack of light. It was a physical weight, accumulated over days of silence. Elias sat in the wingback chair, his figure almost indistinguishable from the shadows that gathered in the corners. He had become a statue of grief, motionless, his hands resting cold and open on his knees. The stopped clocks on the walls stared down like unblinking eyes, witnesses to a life that had ground to a halt. There was no fire in the stove. The air in the room was stale, recycled, holding the chill of the unheated winter. Then came the sound. Scritch, scritch. It filtered through the heavy oak of the front door, a small, abrasive intrusion into the sanctuary of silence. Elias did not move. His mind, wrapped in the cotton wool of depression, dismissed it. A branch scraping against the wood. A rat seeking shelter from the storm. The wind playing tricks on an old man's ears. He closed his eyes tighter, willing the world to go away. He was waiting for the end, not for visitors. Scritch, scratch. The sound persisted. It was rhythmic, urgent, deliberate. It was not the random noise of nature. It was a request. Irritation, hot and prickly, flared in Elias's chest. Why wouldn't the world let him be? He had turned off the sign. He had locked the door. He had paid his dues to society. Go away, he croaked. His voice was a ruin, unused for days, cracking like dry parchment. There is nothing here, he whispered to the empty room. The shop is closed. The owner is closed. He expected the noise to stop. Animals run from human voices. Scavengers flee from signs of life. But the scratching did not stop. It grew louder, more frantic. Claws tearing at the paint, demanding entry. Scritch, scratch, scritch. Resignation replaced the irritation. Shifting his weight, Elias groaned as his stiff joints protested the movement. The heavy wool blanket slid from his legs to the floor, a soft rustle in the quiet. He gripped the arms of the chair, pushing himself up. The floorboards creaked under his slippers, a familiar groan that sounded painfully loud in the hush. Shuffling across the room, he navigated the maze of shadows by memory, avoiding the sharp corners of the display cases. He reached the door. He could feel the cold radiating from the wood, seeping through the grain. He placed a hand on the latch, hesitating. "I have no food," he muttered to the unseen visitor. "I have no time. Go find a warmer doorstep." He meant to leave the latch locked. He meant to turn around and go back to his chair to wait for the cold to take him. But the hand on the latch turned. Perhaps it was muscle memory. Perhaps it was the faint, lingering habit of hospitality. Or perhaps, deep down, the silence had become too loud to bear. Click. The lock disengaged. Elias pulled the heavy door open, just a crack, bracing himself against the gust of wind and rain that waited on the other side. A gust of winter air invaded the shop, swirling through the gap in the door, carrying with it the scent of wet pavement and the rattle of the rain. The candle flame in the room behind Elias danced wildly, casting frantic shadows against the wall of silent clocks. Looking down into the gloom of the street, the old man expected to see nothing but the empty stones, or perhaps a rat scurrying for cover. Instead, he saw a pair of eyes, amber, large, unblinking. Huddled on the doorstep, soaked to the bone, was a small, shivering creature. Its fur was dark with rain, plastered against a frame that looked too fragile to survive the night. It looked like a scrap of russet velvet dropped in a puddle. "A stray," Elias muttered, his heart hardening instinctively against the sight. "Just a beggar." He started to close the door. He had no energy for charity. He had no food to give. To let a living thing in was to invite chaos into his tomb, and he was done with chaos. "Go on," he rasped, waving a hand weakly. "There is no heat here. Find a cellar." The door began to swing shut, the latch clicking toward the strike plate. But the creature did not run. Instead of fleeing the looming giant or the closing barrier, it stepped forward. It wedged a small, wet paw into the gap of the door, and then it spoke. It was not a standard meow. It was not the high-pitched mewl of a kitten seeking milk, nor the yowl of a tomcat seeking a fight. It was a specific sound. Murp, a rising trill ending in a question mark. A chirping, vibration-heavy sound that sounded less like an animal noise and more like a mechanism clicking into place. Elias froze. His hand stopped on the door handle. The breath caught in his throat, burning like cold smoke. That sound. It was the sound Orion used to make when he jumped onto the workbench. It was the sound of greeting, the sound of permission to enter. "Impossible," Elias whispered, the word trembling on his lips. Echoes. Just echoes in an old man's head. He looked down again, squinting through the rain-streaked darkness. The cat looked nothing like Orion. This was a scrawny, desperate thing, matted and muddy, a different shape, a different life. But the eyes held a familiar, stubborn intelligence. They didn't plead, they waited. The cat looked up at the old man, and then, deliberately, looked past him, into the depths of the shop. It saw the covered shape in the corner. It let out the sound again, louder this time, insistent. "Murp." It was a command. "Open the door. The work is waiting." The barrier in Elias's chest, the wall of grief he had built brick by brick over the last week, developed a hairline crack. Logic told him to close the door. Logic told him that coincidences are cruel tricks of the mind. But the silence of the shop behind him felt suddenly unbearable. The prospect of turning around and walking back to that empty chair alone seemed more terrifying than the storm outside. He looked at the wet, shivering scrap of life. He felt the cold wind biting at his ankles. "You are a fool," Elias said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the cat or to himself. "You are looking for a home, and this is just a waiting room." The cat didn't move. It simply lifted a paw, waiting for the gap to widen. With a heavy sigh that released Day's attention, Elias pulled the door open. "Come in then," he grumbled, stepping aside, but only because of the rain. Only for tonight. Crossing the threshold, wet paws left a trail of dark prints on the dusty floorboards, marking a path from the storm into the sanctuary. The air inside was still and cold, yet compared to the biting gale of the street, it felt like a warm embrace. It smelled of safety. It smelled of the past. Shaking his small body violently, the cat sent a spray of rain flying in all directions, misting the legs of the workbench and the glass front of a grandfather clock. The water was shed, but the shivering remained, a deep, muscular tremor born of exhaustion and the shock of temperature change. Elias closed the door. The latch clicked shut, severing the connection to the wet, noisy world outside. The silence of the shop rushed back in to fill the space, but it was different now. It was no longer empty. It held the rhythm of a second breathing thing. "There's a rug by the stove," the old man muttered, gesturing vaguely toward the iron heater. "It's cold, but it's dry. Go on." He expected the stray to run for cover. He expected it to hide under a cabinet or curl up by the cold ashes of the grate, seeking the ghost of heat. But the russet creature did not move toward the stove. It did not look for food. Ignoring the comfort of the rug, the cat moved with a strange, singular purpose. It walked past the workbench. It walked past the display cases. It headed straight for the dark corner of the room. Elias watched, his brow furrowing in confusion. The cat stopped in front of the tall shape draped in the white sheet. The lullaby clock. The object of guilt. The thing Elias could not bear to look at. The small animal circled the base of the covered clock, sniffing the wood through the linen. It rose on its hind legs, placing muddy front paws on the white fabric, kneading it gently. "Here," the posture seemed to say. "This is the center." A soft trill echoed in the corner, a sound of recognition. The cat pressed its flank against the base of the clock and curled up right there on the bare floorboards, guarding the unfinished machine. "Why there?" Elias whispered, a shiver running down his own spine that had nothing to do with the draft. It was unsettled behavior. It was familiar. Orion used to sleep there. Orion used to guard that specific corner when the work was going well. But this wasn't Orion. This was a stranger, a muddy, starving thing from the rain. "You are a strange beast," Elias said, his voice softening despite himself. "Of all the places to sleep, you choose the one thing that is broken." Shaking his head, the old man walked to the small kitchenette in the back. He found a saucer. He found the milk jug, still half full, from the day Orion had stopped drinking. The milk was on the edge of turning, but it would do. He poured a measure of white liquid. Walking back into the shop, he placed the saucer on the floor near the clock. "Drink," he commanded softly. The smell of the milk reached the cat. The amber eyes opened. The nose twitched. The biological imperative finally overrode the spiritual one. The cat rose, approached the saucer, and drank. It was a frantic, messy lapping. The sound of life sustaining itself. Slurp, slap, slurp. Elias watched, For the first time in days, he felt a sensation in his own stomach. Hunger. He hadn't eaten since the burial. Watching the animal eat reminded his own body that it was still functioning. Maybe some tea, he mumbled. Just a cup. When the milk was gone, the cat licked its whiskers clean. It looked at Elias. It blinked. Slow, deliberate, trusting. Then it returned to the base of the clock. It curled into a tight circle, tucking its nose under its tail. Within seconds, the breathing slowed. The shivering stopped. Elias stood in the center of the room. The candle flickered on the table. The shop was still cold. The clocks were still stopped. The grief was still a mountain on his chest. But the air felt thinner. The crushing density of the solitude had been pierced. There was a heartbeat in the corner. Just for tonight. Elias repeated the lie to the shadows. He walked back to his armchair. He sat down. He pulled the wool blanket over his legs. For the first time in a week, he didn't stare into the dark with wide, burning eyes. He listened to the soft, rhythmic breathing coming from the corner. It wasn't a ticking clock, but it was time moving forward nonetheless. Elias closed his eyes, and the shop slept. Chapter 7. The Awakening of the Workshop. Time, once a stagnant pool of black water in the shop, began to trickle forward again. It did not rush. It did not race. It dripped, slow and steady, like melting snow sliding off a roof in the first thaw of spring. The single night of shelter extended into a morning, then an afternoon, and then a week. No verbal contract was signed. No collar was purchased. The arrangement simply solidified, born of mutual need and the quiet, stubborn persistence of the small russet creature. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky of crisp, pale blue and a winter sun that was bright but offered little heat. Beams of this thin light cut through the dusty shop windows, illuminating the floating motes of wood shavings like suspended gold dust. For the first time in days, the air in the shop moved. It was stirred not by a draft, but by activity. The cat, who remained nameless, referred to only as Small One, or You, had taken ownership of the space with frightening speed. He did not act like a guest. He acted like a supervisor returning from a long holiday to find his department in shambles. Patrolling the shelves, he walked between the silent mantel clocks, his tail weaving dangerously close to the porcelain faces, never knocking them over, but dusting them with his passing. He jumped onto the high cabinets, peering down at Elias with critical amber eyes. He rediscovered the sunbeams. Finding the precise angle where the light hit the oak floorboards at 10 a.m., he would sprawl there, washing his face, turning the grooming ritual into a performance of domestic normalcy. Elias watched him, sitting in his armchair with a cup of tea that was actually warm. The old man observed the creature. "You are too comfortable," Elias grumbled, blowing steam from his cup. "You act as if you built this place." The cat paused mid-lick, looking at Elias with a flat, unimpressed stare. Then he resumed washing a paw. The rejection of the comment was so absolute, so familiarly arrogant, that a small, rusty sound escaped Elias's throat. A chuckle. It was a dry, cracking sound, painful to make, but it broke the tension in the room. The ghost of the shop, the heavy, suffocating gloom, recoiled slightly. The routine began to reassemble itself. Morning meant the sound of a tin can opening. The snap hiss of the tab was a summons that brought the cat running from anywhere in the room. Noon meant a shared sandwich. A scrap of ham dropped accidentally on the floor. Evening meant the stove. Elias found himself lighting the cast iron stove, not just for himself, but because he couldn't bear to see the cat shivering. As the wood caught and the iron began to tick with heat, the shop filled with the scent of burning pine, a smell of life. And with the heat came the sound, the purr. It started low, a subsonic vibration when the cat curled up on the rug. But as the room warmed, the volume increased. Rumble, thrum, rumble, thrum. It filled the corners where the shadows used to gather. It replaced the ticking of the clocks. It became the new metronome of the shop, a heartbeat that said, "We are here. We are warm. We are continuing." Elias found his eyes drawn more and more to the workbench. It was still cluttered with the debris of his grief, the scattered tools, the layer of dust. But the cat had claimed the bench too. He would jump up, sit in the empty space where the magnifying lamp used to shine, and stare at the covered lullaby clock. Then he would look at Elias. "Well?" the amber eyes seemed to ask. "The sun is up. The belly is full. Why are we sitting?" The pressure was subtle, but relentless. Elias felt the itch in his fingers. The muscle memory of a lifetime of tinkering was waking up, irritated by the idleness. He stood up from the armchair. He walked to the bench. He didn't touch the tools yet. He just ran a hand over the wood, clearing a space. The cat headbutted his hand. Elias looked down. "You are a pest," the old man whispered, scratching the cat behind the ears. A relentless, demanding pest. But he didn't walk away. He stayed at the bench. And for the first time, he looked at the covered clock, not with fear, but with a question. The white linen sheet slid from the wood with a sound like a sigh, pooling on the floorboards in a heap of soft folds. For the first time in weeks, the lullaby clock breathed the air of the shop. Even unfinished, it was a masterpiece of potential. The cherry wood, dark and rich as spilled wine, gleamed under the weak winter sunlight filtering through the dust. The face of the clock, with its mother-of-pearl stars, caught the light and scattered it in a spectrum of faint, milky iridescence. But the beauty lay in the open chest of the machine. Here, the brass guts were exposed. Gears the size of coins nested against gears the size of dinner plates. Springs coiled like sleeping snakes, waiting for the tension that would give them life. And in the center, the heart of the matter, the musical cylinder. It was a drum of polished steel, studded with thousands of microscopic pins. Each pin was a note. Each pin was a fragment of Alara's voice, encoded in metal, waiting to strike the teeth of the musical comb and sing. Elias stared at it. The familiarity of the mechanism washed over him, warring with the nausea of his own anxiety. To look at it was to see his love. To touch it was to risk breaking her. "It's just metal," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Just physics. Just friction." He reached for his jeweler's loop, screwing it into his eye socket. The world narrowed down to a magnified circle of clarity. He picked up the tweezers. They felt foreign, heavy, cold. His hand, which had once been steady enough to balance a ruby on a needlepoint, hovered over the mechanism. It shook. Not a large shake, but a fine, high-frequency tremor. The vibration of age, yes, but also of terror. The task was simple. Insert a locking pin into the governor assembly to stabilize the rotation. A task he had performed 1,000 times on 1,000 lesser clocks. He lowered the tweezers. The tip of the pin danced in the magnified view, circling the hole but refusing to enter. Click, click. Metal struck metal, missing the mark. Elias held his breath, willing his muscles to freeze. Just one pin. He pushed. The tremor spiked. The tweezers slipped. The tiny brass pin pinged off the steel cylinder and fell into the dark, sawdust-filled recesses of the clock's casing. lost. Elias dropped the tweezers. They clattered onto the workbench, the sound harsh and violent in the quiet room. He pulled the loop from his eye and threw it down. "I can't," he choked out. The panic rose in his throat, hot and sour. "I am too old. The hands are gone. The skill is gone." He gripped the edge of the workbench, his knuckles turning white. The failure wasn't just mechanical, it was spiritual. If he couldn't place a pin, he couldn't keep the promise. If he couldn't keep the promise, the mist he had seen in his nightmares would return. He looked at the sheet on the floor. He wanted to pick it up. He wanted to cover the clock again, to hide the evidence of his inadequacy, to retreat back to the armchair and the dark. He reached for the linen. Useless, he hissed at himself. Broken. The white sheet rustled as Elias gripped the hem, ready to pull it back over the cherry wood skeleton, ready to bury the hope for another season. But the sheet did not move. There was a weight on it. Elias looked down. The russet cat was standing on the pile of linen, his claws hooked into the fabric, pinning it to the floor. His ears were swiveled forward, not in relaxation, but in alert, hunting focus. He wasn't looking at Elias. He was looking at the dark gap in the clock's casing, where the brass pin had disappeared. "Get off," Elias muttered, his voice lacking conviction. "It's gone. It's over." The cat ignored him. Lowering his head, the small creature peered into the machinery. His whiskers swept against the brass gears, sensing the air currents inside the box. He extended a single paw. It was a movement of surgical precision. The claws remained sheathed, only the soft velvet pads searching the darkness. He reached deep into the sawdust-filled recess. He paused. He hooked. With a flick of his wrist, he swiped backward. Something glinted in the dust motes. The tiny brass locking pin skittered out of the clock, sliding across the polished workbench, spinning to a halt right in front of Elias's hand. Elias stared at it. It seemed impossibly small, a speck of gold delivered from the abyss. He looked at the cat. The animal didn't look proud. He simply sat down on the workbench, right next to the pin. He curled his tail around the tiny object, framing it, claiming it. Then he did something he hadn't done before. He laid his heavy head directly on Elias's wrist. The fur was warm. The weight was solid. And the purr began. Rumble, thrum. Rumble, thrum. The vibration traveled through Elias's skin, into the bone of his arm, diffusing the nervous electricity of the tremor. It was a grounding wire. The chaotic shaking of age met the steady, rhythmic frequency of the cat, and the chaos lost. Elias felt his pulse slowing down to match the purr. He looked at his hand. It was pinned under the cat's chin, trapped by affection. "You are not going to let me quit, are you?" Elias whispered. The cat blinked slowly. "No, we are working." Elias didn't try to move his arm away. Instead, he reached for the tweezers with his other hand. He picked up the pin. He moved it toward the mechanism. This time, he didn't try to do it alone. He leaned his forearm against the cat's warm flank, using the animal's body as a steady rest. A living fulcrum. The tremor was still there, faint and ghostly, but the anchor held. The tip of the pin found the hole in the governor assembly. It slid in. Click. Perfect fit. Elias exhaled, a breath he felt he had been holding for years. He tightened the screw. He tested the gear. It spun freely, smooth as silk. The block was gone. The paralysis was broken. "One piece," Elias murmured, a strange lightness spreading in his chest. "Just one piece. But one piece becomes two, and two becomes a movement." The cat lifted his head from Elias's wrist, satisfied. He stood up, stretched, and settled down on the corner of the bench, watching with half-closed eyes. Elias reached for the next gear. Outside, the winter sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of violet and bruised orange. Inside, the lamp was lit. The silence of the tomb had retreated. The shop was alive again, filled with the soft sounds of metal on metal, and the steady driving engine of a cat keeping the time. The work had begun. Chapter 8. The Winter of Life. Winter settled over the town like a heavy iron lid. The pale sunlight of early January retreated, replaced by days that were little more than gray twilights, sandwiched between long, freezing nights. Snow piled up against the shop door, muffling the sound of the street, turning the world outside into a silent, white, abstract painting. Inside the shop, the air grew sharp. The cast-iron stove fought a losing battle against the draft that seeped through the ancient window frames. Frost bloomed on the inside of the glass, intricate ferns of ice that thickened by the hour, obscuring the view of the cobblestones. Yet in this refrigerated silence, the work had advanced. Weeks of steady, quiet labor had transformed the Lullaby Clock. It was no longer a skeleton of wood and brass. It was a near-living thing. The cherry wood case had been polished to a deep, dark luster that seemed to hold its own inner fire. The face was complete, the mother-of-pearl stars gleaming against the midnight blue enamel. Inside, the mechanism was 90% installed. The gears were aligned. The weights were hung. But the cost of this progress was visible in the maker. Elias had grown thin. The tweed jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, the fabric draping over bone rather than muscle. His movements, once fluid, with the renewed purpose of the work, had become brittle. Cough. The sound tore through the quiet shop, a wet, rattling bark that shook the old man's frame. He gripped the edge of the workbench, knuckles white, waiting for the spasm to pass. It left him breathless, a thin sheen of cold sweat beating on his forehead despite the chill in the room. "Just a cold," he whispered to the cat, wiping his mouth with a handkerchief that he quickly hid in his pocket. "Just the winter dust." But the cat knew better. Perched on the high shelf, wrapping a tail around paws that were never quite warm enough these days, the russet guardian watched with narrowing eyes. Animals see what humans ignore. They see the aura of energy that surrounds a living thing. For weeks, Elias's light had been flickering. It wasn't the gray mist of guilt anymore. That had receded when the work began. This was something simpler, and perhaps more terrible. It was the fading of the battery. The biological clock was winding down faster than the mechanical one could be wound up. Every hour Elias spent bent over the magnifier, straining his eyes, sacrificing sleep for just one more gear, was an hour borrowed from a dwindling account. The cold in the shop became aggressive. One evening, the fire in the stove sputtered and died, the coal bucket empty. Elias didn't move to refill it. He sat at the bench shivering violently, his fingers clumsy with cold as he tried to polish a brass pendulum bob. "I can't stop," he mumbled, his teeth chattering. "If I stop to get coal, I might not start again." He was running on a fuel of pure obsession. The cat jumped down from the shelf. He landed on the bench. He walked over to the shivering hands. He didn't nudge them this time. He lay down directly on top of them. He covered the freezing fingers with his warm, furred belly. Elias stopped. He looked down at the animal. "You are warm?" the old man said, his voice sounding far away. "You are always so warm." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the cat's flank. The heat was a lifeline. But even through the fur, The cat could feel the icy chill radiating from the man's skin. It was the temperature of stone in winter. The race was no longer against his skill. It was no longer against his guilt. It was a race against the inevitable. The clock needed 3 more days. The man, by the sound of his rattling chest, might only have 2. Gravity finally claimed its due. Rising from the workbench to fetch a new file, Elias's legs simply folded. There was no stumble, no desperate reaching for support, just a slow, crumpling descent to the floorboards. Lying there, cheek pressed against the sawdust, the world tilted on its axis. The rows of clocks on the wall seemed to elongate, stretching into towering monoliths of judgment. Not yet. He whispered into the wood, "I have to wind the mainspring." But the command did not reach his muscles. The fever had arrived. It came not as a fire, but as a heavy, suffocating fog, wrapping his mind in cotton wool, dulling the sharp edges of reality until everything felt distant and impossible. Somehow, driven by the reptile brain's instinct to hide when wounded, he managed to crawl. Dragging himself up the narrow staircase to the small living quarters above the shop, every step was a mountain climb. The cat followed close at his heels, making low, anxious trills, nudging his ankles, urging him upward. Reaching the bed, Elias collapsed onto the quilt without removing his boots. The room spun. Shadows in the corners began to detach themselves from the walls. They were not natural shadows cast by the street lamp outside. They were the gray mist, the entity Orion had seen in the pool of remembrance. Sensing the weakness of the host, the mist returned. It crept across the floorboards like dry ice, swirling around the bedposts, rising to lick at the sheets. It smelled of stagnant water and forgotten promises. "Alara?" Elias mumbled, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the ceiling. "I'm trying. The gears are slipping." He was hallucinating. In his mind, he wasn't in bed. He was back at the bench, but the clock kept moving away from him. Every time he reached for the screwdriver, the table extended, pushing, the work just out of reach. He thrashed on the mattress, his hands grasping at empty air, fingers twitching as they tried to assemble a phantom machine. "The spring," he gasped, sweat soaking his collar. "It needs the tension, it needs the song." Downstairs, in the cold dark of the shop, the lullaby clock stood silent. It was 99% complete. The body was polished, the face was set, the musical cylinder was pinned. But it lacked the kinetic energy. It lacked the winding of the great mainspring that would drive the music. Without that final turn of the key, it was just a beautiful box of metal. It was a throat without a breath. And upstairs, the only hand capable of turning that key was lying limp on the coverlet. The mist grew bolder. Rising up the side of the bed, it began to settle over Elias's chest. It felt heavy, a leaden blanket designed to suppress the struggle. It whispered to him in the voice of his own exhaustion. "Sleep," the mist suggested. "It is too hard. You are too old. Let it go." Elias's breathing shallowed. The rattle in his throat quieted, replaced by a terrifying stillness. The fight was leaving him. The guilt was winning. If he died now, the mist would claim him. He would become part of the heavy atmosphere of the shop, a shade drifting among the unsold timepieces, forever looking at the covered corner, forever unable to touch it. The separation would be eternal. Orion, sitting on the pillow next to the old man's head, saw the mist tightening. He saw the light of the soul dimming to a single, fragile spark. Hissing softly, the cat batted at the gray vapor. His paw passed through it, disturbing the smoke, but not dispelling it. This was a spiritual weight. Claws could not cut it. Only life could fight it. And Elias was running out of life. Swiping at smoke is a game for kittens, not for guardians. Realizing that teeth and claws were useless against the encroaching cold, the russet cat ceased his attack. He stood on the pillow, fur bristling, looking down at the gray face of the man who had given him a name, even if he couldn't remember what that name was. The mist was winning. It had settled over Elias's sternum, a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed the air out of the lungs and slowed the heart to a dangerous, stuttering rhythm. Orion felt a pull in his own chest. Not the ache of hunger, nor the compass pull that had led him to the shop. This was a deeper tug, a resonance. Deep in the cellular memory of his body, buried under layers of cat instinct, a remnant of the golden field stirred. A single drop of the eternal sun he had carried down from the sky. He knew, without knowing how, that this fire could be shared. But fuel shared is fuel spent. Stepping onto the heaving chest of the old man, Orion settled directly over the heart. He didn't curl up to sleep. He crouched, pressing his belly hard against the wool of the nightshirt, maximizing the contact. He closed his eyes. He ignited the engine. The purr began. Rumble, thrum. Rumble, thrum. It was not the soft, contented sound of a pet being stroked. It was a loud, driving vibration, aggressive and rhythmic. It was a frequency designed to penetrate bone and stimulate blood flow. Orion pushed. He visualized the heat in his own small body, the spark of life that kept him moving, and he pushed it downward, through his skin, into the cold flesh of the man. Take it, the instinct commanded. I have enough. Take it. The sensation was dizzying. As the warmth flowed out of him, the room seemed to spin. The edges of his vision went gray. The cold of the room rushed into his own extremities, turning his ears and tail to ice. He was acting as a battery, jump-starting a dying machine with his own limited charge. But it worked. Beneath him, the rhythm of the heart changed. The stuttering, irregular beat smoothed out. It grew stronger. Thump, 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 thump. The gray mist, repelled by the sudden surge of vitality, recoiled. It hissed, a sound like steam escaping a valve, and retreated to the corners of the room, waiting, but kept at bay. Elias gasped. His eyes snapped open. The milky confusion of the fever was gone, replaced by a crystalline, terrifying clarity. He didn't feel healed. He felt electrified. He felt a surge of artificial energy coursing through his veins, a loan of adrenaline that he knew would have a steep interest rate. He looked down at his chest. He saw the cat. The animal's eyes were half closed, the russet fur dull and trembling, drained by the effort. You, Elias rasped, his hand coming up to cup the small, brave head. You are giving me your time. The cat blinked slowly. Use it. Elias understood. This wasn't a recovery. This was a rally. A final window of opportunity before the window slammed shut forever. He sat up, the room swaying violently before steadying. He swung his legs out of bed. His boots hit the floor with a heavy thud. The mainspring, Elias said, his voice steady for the first time in days. He stood up. He swayed, caught his balance on the bedpost, and straightened his spine. He looked at the door leading downstairs to the dark shop. One last time, old friend, he whispered to the cat. Orion jumped down from the bed. He stumbled, weak, but righted himself. Together, the man burning with borrowed fire and the cat shivering with the cold of the void, they walked out of the room, down into the dark, toward the unfinished symphony. The wooden staircase groaned under the weight of the descent, each creak sounding like a gunshot in the stillness of the shop. Elias moved not with the fluid grace of health, but with the jerky, mechanical determination of a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a final, desperate command. The borrowed fire in his veins burned hot, masking the ache in his joints, but he knew it was a finite resource. He was burning the furniture to keep the house warm. Reaching the bottom floor, the shop greeted him with a blast of refrigerated air. The frost on the windows had thickened into opaque sheets of ice, turning the streetlight outside into a diffuse, ghostly glow. Beyond the glass, the winter storm had intensified. The wind howled down the chimney, rattling the damper, demanding entry. It was a chaotic, violent night, nature seemingly revolting against the quiet work about to be done. But inside the circle of the workbench, there was calm. Elias lit the articulated lamp. The pool of yellow light flooded the cherry wood of the Lullaby Clock, igniting the deep reds of the grain. It stood there, silent and expectant, a monument to a memory. "One night," Elias whispered, his voice steady. "Give me one night." He sat down on his stool. The wood felt hard against his bones. To his right, the russet cat leaped up onto the bench. The jump was clumsy. Claws scrabbled for grip before hauling the small body up. Orion did not sit tall this time. He collapsed onto his side near the tools, his breathing shallow, his amber eyes fixed on Elias's hands. The witness was in place. The maker was in place. Elias reached out and picked up the winding key. It was a heavy, T-shaped piece of brass, tarnished by the oils of his own skin from 1,000 nervous touches over the years. It was the instrument of life. Without it, the potential energy of the mainspring remained just that, potential. Holding the key, Elias looked at his reflection in the polished brass pendulum. He saw a ghost. A man with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned too bright. He didn't care. He wasn't doing this for the man in the reflection. He was doing it for the woman in the dark. "For you, Ilara," he murmured. He inserted the key into the winding point on the face of the clock. The metal slot accepted the brass tongue with a satisfying, snug fit. Clunk. The connection was made? Outside, a clap of thunder shook the foundations of the shop, rattling the teeth of the cuckoo clocks on the wall. Elias didn't flinch. He gripped the handle of the key. The resistance of the mainspring would be immense. It was a massive coil of tempered steel, designed to drive the mechanism for 8 days without rest. It required strength to turn. Strength he wasn't sure he had. He took a breath, filling his rattling lungs with the smell of walnut oil and ozone. He turned his wrist. Chapter 9. The Last Winding. The wooden staircase groaned under the weight of the descent, each creak sounding like a gunshot in the stillness of the shop. Elias moved not with the fluid grace of health, but with the jerky, mechanical determination of a puppet whose strings were being pulled by a final, desperate command. The borrowed fire in his veins burned hot, masking the ache in his joints. But he knew it was a finite resource. He was burning the furniture to keep the house warm. Reaching the bottom floor, the shop greeted him with a blast of refrigerated air. The frost on the windows had thickened into opaque sheets of ice, turning the streetlight outside into a diffuse, ghostly glow. Beyond the glass, the winter storm had intensified. The wind howled down the chimney, rattling the damper, demanding entry. It was a chaotic, violent night, nature seemingly revolting against the quiet work about to be done. But inside the circle of the workbench, there was calm. Elias lit the articulated lamp. The pool of yellow light flooded the cherry wood of the Lullaby Clock, igniting the deep reds of the grain. It stood there, silent and expectant. A monument to a memory. One night, Elias whispered, his voice steady. Give me one night. He sat down on his stool. The wood felt hard against his bones. To his right, the russet cat leaped up onto the bench. The jump was clumsy. Claws scrabbled for grip before hauling the small body up. Orion did not sit tall this time. He collapsed onto his side near the tools, his breathing shallow, his amber eyes fixed on Elias's hands. The witness was in place. The maker was in place. Elias reached out and picked up the winding key. It was a heavy, T-shaped piece of brass, tarnished by the oils of his own skin from 1,000 nervous touches over the years. It was the instrument of life. Without it, the potential energy of the mainspring remained just that, potential. Holding the key, Elias looked at his reflection in the polished brass pendulum. He saw a ghost. A man with hollow cheeks and eyes that burned too bright. He didn't care. He wasn't doing this for the man in the reflection. He was doing it for the woman in the dark. For you, Alara, he murmured. He inserted the key into the winding point on the face of the clock. The metal slot accepted the brass tongue with a satisfying snug fit. Clunk. The connection was made. Outside, a clap of thunder shook the foundations of the shop, rattling the teeth of the cuckoo clocks on the wall. Elias didn't flinch. He gripped the handle of the key. The resistance of the mainspring would be immense. It was a massive coil of tempered steel, designed to drive the mechanism for 8 days without rest. It required strength to turn. Strength he wasn't sure he had. He took a breath, filling his rattling lungs with the smell of walnut oil and ozone. He turned his wrist. Metal groaned against metal, a sound of protest that rose from the belly of the cherrywood case. The mainspring of the Lullaby Clock was not merely a coil of steel. It was a physical manifestation of time withheld. It had sat cold and dormant for years, stiffening in its housing, resisting the torque applied by the trembling hand. Elias gritted his teeth. He turned the key. Click. One ratchet tooth engaged. The resistance was immediate and brutal. The key fought back, trying to spin in, reverse, trying to snap the old man's wrist. It required a steady, increasing pressure that demanded more torque than his wasted muscles should have possessed. Sweat broke out on his brow, cold and clammy, stinging his eyes. Click. Second tooth. Come on, he hissed, his breath hitching in his chest. Wake up. The room seemed to narrow down to the brass handle in his hand. The storm outside, the wind howling against the eaves, the rain lashing the glass, faded into background noise. There was only the battle between the man and the machine. Every turn of the key was a memory reclaimed. Click. The day they met. This click. The sound of her laugh in the kitchen. Click. The silence of the hospital room. The spring grew tighter. The tension built, storing the potential energy that would drive the song. But Elias's strength was fading. The borrowed fire from the cat was burning low. His vision blurred at the edges, a gray vignette encroaching on the pool of yellow light. His hand slipped. The key jerked violently. Gasping, he clamped his other hand over the first, doubling his grip, throwing his body weight against the brass T-bar. Pain shot up his arm, settling deep in his shoulder, a line of fire that mirrored the burning in his lungs. I can't, the thought whispered in his mind. It is too heavy. The guilt is too heavy. A sound cut through the internal monologue. A soft, sharp trill from the workbench. Elias looked down. Orion had lifted his head. The amber eyes were wide, fixed on Elias with an intensity that burned through the fog of exhaustion. The cat did not look at the man with pity. He looked with expectation. "Do not stop," the gaze commanded. "I gave you the time. Do not waste it." The cat extended a paw, resting it on Elias's sleeve. The claws extended slightly, pricking the skin through the fabric. A sharp, grounding sensation. Stay here. Stay present. Elias drew a breath that rattled in his throat like dry leaves. He looked back at the key. He didn't pull from his muscles this time. He pulled from his soul. He thought of Alara waiting in the dark. He thought of the silence he had lived in for so long. "For you," he groaned. He turned. Click, click, click. 3 rapid turns. The spring tightened to its limit. The metal sang with tension. Click. The final ratchet locked into place. The mainspring was wound. The heart of the clock was fully charged, holding a week of life in its coils. Elias slumped over the bench, releasing the key. He gasped for air, his heart hammering a frantic, uneven rhythm against his ribs. He had done it. The potential energy was stored. The machine was primed. Now, there was only one thing left to do. The release. He reached out a shaking hand toward the small silver lever on the side of the casing. The switch that would engage the musical cylinder and start the pendulum. He looked at the cat. "Are you listening, old friend?" Elias whispered. Orion blinked slowly. "I am listening." Elias flicked the lever. The silver lever slid into the play position with a soft, decisive snick. For a heartbeat, the shop held its breath. The storm outside seemed to pause in deference to the moment. Then, inside the dark cherrywood chest of the clock, the universe began to move. First came the pendulum, a heavy disc of polished brass, suspended on a rod of Invar steel, swung to the left, tick. It swung to the right, tock. It was a heartbeat. Strong, steady, deep. It was a sound that anchored the room, a rhythmic pulse that pushed back against the chaos of the night. Then came the whir of the governor fan, spinning up to speed to regulate the release of energy, a sound like the wings of a hummingbird trapped in a box. And then the music. The steel cylinder began to rotate. The tiny brass pins, placed with such agonizing precision by shaking hands, struck the teeth of the tuned musical comb. Plink, plink. The notes were crystal clear. They resonated within the wooden casing, amplified by the cherry heartwood, growing warmer and richer as they filled the air. It was not a complex symphony. It was a simple tune. 3 notes up, 2 notes down. A resolve in the minor key. It was Alara's lullaby, the song she had hummed in the kitchen while the kettle boiled. The song she had sung to the empty air when she thought no one was listening. It was a melody made of forgiveness and quiet evenings. Elias slumped against the workbench, his eyes wide, staring at the spinning mechanism. The sound washed over him. It wasn't just metal striking metal. It was a voice. Every note peeled away a layer of the gray, suffocating mist that had choked him for years. The guilt of the unkept promise dissolved. The weight of the failure evaporated. The shop, which had been a tomb of silence, was now a sanctuary of sound. The music swirled around the dusty shelves, touching the sleeping faces of the other clocks, waking the spirit of the place. Elias felt tears running down his cheeks, hot, cleansing tears that he didn't bother to wipe away. "I hear you," he whispered to the machine. "I hear you, Alara." He wasn't crying for the loss anymore. He was crying for the return. She wasn't gone. She was here, encoded in the brass, immortalized in the rhythm. As long as the clock ticked, she would sing. On the workbench, the russet cat lifted his head. Orion's ears swiveled toward the sound. The amber eyes softened, losing their hunter's focus and taking on a dreamy, distant quality. He remembered this song, not from the shop, but from before, from the time of warm laps and soft hands. The music bridged the gap between his two lives, the celestial and the mortal. It was the frequency of home. He looked at Elias. The old man's face was transformed. The lines of pain had smoothed out. The terror of death was gone, replaced by a profound, radiant peace. The job was done. The circle was closed. Orion laid his head back down on his paws. The vibration of the music traveled through the wood of the bench and into his body, vibrating against his own fading heart. It was a good song to rest to. Inside the clock, the cylinder turned. Outside, the wind howled. But in the center of the storm, the lullaby played on, perfect and eternal. Plink, plink, tick, tock. Everything was exactly as it should be. Chapter 10. The Reunion. Bathed in the melody of the chimes, the urgency drained away from the old man's limbs, leaving behind a weightless, floating sensation. The work was finished. The promise was kept. Leaving the workbench for the last time, Elias gathered the russet cat into his arms. The animal felt light, almost insubstantial, a bundle of warmth and vibration that hummed against his chest. Moving slow, guided more by memory than by sight, he crossed the shop floor to the wingback chair by the cold stove. He sat down. The worn velvet groaned softly, accepting his weight like an old friend offering a final embrace. He adjusted the wool blanket over his legs, tucking the cat into the crook of his arm. The shop around them began to soften. The sharp edges of the display cases blurred. The dust motes dancing in the lamplight slowed down, suspending themselves in the air like stars caught in amber. The only reality was the sound. Plink, plink. The lullaby clock played on, filling the room with the architecture of a song. It was a bridge of notes, spanning the gap between the here and the there. Elias leaned his head back against the chair. He looked at the ceiling, but he didn't see the water stains or the peeling paint. He saw the face of Alara. She was smiling. Not the sad smile of the photograph on the mantel, but the radiant, welcoming smile of their wedding day. "I'm ready," he whispered to the room. The fear that had dogged him for years, the fear of the cold, the fear of the dark, had evaporated. There was no cold anymore. The music had warmed the air. In the corner of the shop, where the shadows were deepest, a figure emerged. It was not the gray, suffocating mist of guilt. It was a shadow, tall and silent, draped in the fabric of the night itself. Orion lifted his head from Elias's arm. The cat looked at the shadow. He did not hiss. He did not growl. He recognized the visitor. It was the same presence he had met at the edge of the universe, the same quiet authority that governed the falling of leaves and the stopping of hearts. The visitor did not approach with a scythe or a weapon. It stood patiently, hands clasped, waiting for the song to finish. It was the usher, the guide who knows the way when the eyes can no longer see. Elias felt the presence too. He didn't turn to look. He didn't need to. He felt a gentle hand resting on his shoulder, a touch that was cool, but not freezing, a touch that said, "The shift is over. Put down the tools." His breathing synced with the pendulum. In, tick, out, tock. The rhythm of his life slowed down to match the rhythm of his masterpiece. He stroked the cat's fur one last time. "We did good work," he murmured, his eyes closing. "We made something beautiful." The cat purred a final, soft agreement. The shop faded. The rain outside ceased to exist. There was only the chair, the music, and the peace of a long day ending. The space between heartbeats stretched, growing longer and longer, until it became a horizon line. Elias took a breath, a shallow, quiet draft of the shop's dusty air, and simply did not release it. The chest settled. The hand resting on the wool blanket went still. The biological clock had stopped, but the mechanical one played on. Plink. Plink. The lullaby clock continued its faithful vigil, filling the silence of the transition with the song of love. On the old man's lap, the small russet cat felt the shift. The warmth beneath him began to fade, retreating inward like a tide going out. The rhythm he had been guarding was gone. For a moment, there was only the confusion of the animal mind, the distress of a pet who has lost his person. But then, as the cat's own breathing slowed to a final halt, the veil tore. The contract of oblivion, signed at the edge of the universe, had a clause. Until the work is done. The work was done. The heavy curtain of amnesia that had shrouded the cat's mind since his fall from the sky dissolved. The memories rushed back, not as a trickle, but as a flood of golden light, the golden field, the taste of eternal cream, the guardian of seconds, the choice to fall. He remembered. He wasn't just a stray who had scratched at a door. He was Orion. He was the traveler who had abandoned paradise to save a soul. Opening his eyes, he did not see the dim shop anymore. He saw the underlying structure of reality. The walls of the shop became transparent, revealing the starlight behind the brick. The dust motes turned into floating diamonds. Orion stood up on the lifeless knees of his friend. He shook himself. The sensation of hunger vanished. The ache in his hip vanished. The gray fur shed from his spirit like a winter coat, falling away in spring. He was radiant again, a being of pure intention and russet fire. He looked down at Elias's face. The old man looked peaceful, the lines of pain erased by the finality of the exit. "You did well," Orion whispered. It wasn't a meow, it was a thought, clear and articulate, spoken in the language of the spirits. "You finished the song." The shadow in the corner stepped forward, the usher. She lowered her hand toward Elias. "Come," she said softly. "She is waiting." A light rose from the chair. It peeled away from the heavy, worn-out shell of the body. It was Elias, but stripped of the age and the tweed. He looked young. He looked light. The spirit of Elias stood up, blinking, looking around the room as if seeing it for the first time. He looked at the usher. He looked at the clock playing its tune. Then he looked at the cat. His eyes widened. He saw the glow. He saw the truth behind the animal he had fed. "You?" Elias gasped, his voice echoing like a bell. "It was you. The whole time." Orion sat tall, his tail wrapped around his paws, his amber eyes shining with the wisdom of the spheres. "I told you I wouldn't leave you to the cold," Orion replied. Elias reached out a hand. This time, when he touched the cat, he didn't feel fur. He felt the energy of a star. "You came back," Elias said, awe coloring his tone. "You came all the way back down." "It was a long fall," Orion admitted, "but the landing was worth it." The usher smiled, a gentle expression that illuminated the dark corners of the room. "The door is open," she said, gesturing to the wall behind the clock. The brick melted away. Beyond it lay not the street, nor the rain, but a field of tall, golden wheat, swaying under an endless afternoon sun. The smell of oat grass and warmth flooded the shop, chasing away the last of the winter chill. Elias looked at the field. He looked at the clock he had built. Can we go? Elias asked, looking at Orion. We can, Orion said. The mainspring is wound. The song will play forever. He jumped from the chair. He didn't land on the floorboards. He landed on the air, floating inches above the ground. He turned to Elias. Walk with me, clockmaker. The time for work is over. Stepping through the wall of the shop was not like walking through a door. It was like waking from a long, confusing dream into a crisp, clear morning. The smell of dust and walnut oil vanished, replaced instantly by the sweet, heavy scent of sun-warmed clover and wild honey. The floorboards beneath their feet softened, turning into the rich, yielding earth of the golden field. Elias looked down at his hands. The tremors were gone. The age spots, the scars from slipping chisels, the gnarled knuckles of arthritis, all erased. His skin was smooth, tanned by a sun that had not touched him in decades. He flexed his fingers, feeling the strength of his youth returning like a tide coming in. Beside him, Orion strode through the tall wheat, his tail held high, a flag of russet fire against the violet sky. He nudged Elias's leg, a solid, grounding weight. It is warm here, Elias whispered, the air filling his lungs without a rattle. It is finally warm. Ahead of them, standing beneath the shade of the silver birch grove, a figure waited. She was turned away, watching the wind ripple through the grass, but Elias knew the shape of her shoulders. He knew the way the light caught in her hair. The lullaby clock back in the shop was playing her song, but here, the music was in the wind itself. Ilara? She turned. There was no sickness in her face, no shadow of the hospital. She smiled, and the years of winter melted away from Elias's soul. She opened her arms. Elias ran. He didn't shuffle. He sprinted through the wheat, light as a boy, meeting her in the center of the grove. The embrace was solid. It was real. It was the closing of the circle. Orion sat down nearby, watching them. He blinked his amber eyes, satisfied. The mist of guilt was gone. The anchor was lifted. The watcher's shift was over. Back in the waking world, the shop remained. It stood on the cobblestone street, dark and quiet against the storm. But inside, it was not empty. The lullaby clock continued to tick, its pendulum swinging with a steady, hypnotic rhythm that defied the silence. The music played on, soft and low, filling the room with a vibration of pure peace. Passers-by who walked past the window in the years to come would stop, cocking their heads, wondering why they suddenly felt calmer. They would feel a strange warmth radiating from the glass, a sense that inside those walls, everything was right. The shop had become a sanctuary, a monument to the love that transcends the dark. And now the story drifts away, like a leaf floating down a river. The image of the golden field fades, leaving only the warmth of the sun behind your eyelids. You are safe here. Just like Elias, you have finished your work for the day. The tools are down, the door is locked, the storm is outside, and you are inside. The rhythm of the lullaby clock is your rhythm now. Tick, tock, slow, steady, deep. There are no promises left to keep tonight. There are no miles left to walk. There is only the pillow. There is only the quiet. Orion is watching. The guardian is at the gate. Let the heavy mist of sleep settle over you, not as a weight, but as a comfort. Drift, float, rest. Good night, traveler. The clock is wound. The night is yours. Sleep, sleep, sleep.